Welcome everybody to the June crypto astrology webinar. We are going to make this webinar a little bit more look longer term into what's happening for the rest of this year. We will begin by, let me begin by sharing my screen. Screen share coming up. If you have any questions, just pop them into the chat and we can, I'll address them. Okay, so the crypto astrology June 2022 forecast with a bit of a longer term view into further months into the year. As I always put this first slide, I'm not a financial advisor. I am an astrologer with around 30 years professional astrology experience. Really a student of astrology. No astrologer is ever other than a long-term student. There's a never-ending rabbit hole of learning around astrology. I have specialized in what's known as questioning astrology, and I'm going to share a very interesting example of a client in the past week or two who has asked me a financial question, which I think is very interesting in light of what I'm seeing in terms of the astrology for the coming year for the financial markets and for the crypto space. So what we have noticed is that crypto really is the new technology. And crypto is part, in many ways, seen as part of the tech financial markets. We have seen direct correlations between the Bitcoin movements with the NASDAQ chart movements. So looking at the NASDAQ chart is very interesting, and we are certainly can get some interesting forecast views on what's happening in the NASDAQ. So this is where we are right now in the NASDAQ. As we see, since, let me just move something out of the way here. Yeah, really since April, the NASDAQ, beginning of April, the NASDAQ has been on a decline and Bitcoin has followed suit. So if we look at the astrological transits to the Bitcoin chart, so just to explain some of the terminology, a transit is the current positions of the planets relative to the planets that make up the chart of the person or the entity. So in this case, we are talking the NASDAQ chart. So what I'm going to talk about here is that we've got, if we look back at what's happened in March, we'll see a direct correlation between the NASDAQ index going down on this is on the weekly. And we'll see that as Saturn came onto the sun, what's known as a conjunction. So if we go back, we'll see the sun. The sun is the core, most essential part in an astrology chart. Everybody knows their sun sign. The sun is really seen as your core essential piece. So things that happen to the sun, we really have to take note of. And even more so in the Bitcoin chart, the sun is a very sensitive point. That's due to the fact that the Bitcoin chart has a Leo rising, and the sun as a planet is the ruler of the zodiacal sign of Leo. So with Saturn conjunct the sun, it came into effect and moved out of effect exactly on this down period here. So we see a very interesting correlation. Then we noticed here that we've just recently, from the 5th of May through to the 12th of May, we had Jupiter opposing the NASDAQ Pluto. And again, we had a very direct correlation of a downward trend in the index for the NASDAQ. What has come into effect really since the 12th, 13th of May is So we're seeing a bit of up and down volatility, which the word volatility is a word that is very correlative with the word Uranus. Uranus is the planet of surprises. And there's also a measure of relationship between the energy of Uranus and technology. So Saturn is very much the old world, the stable kind of energies. Uranus coming onto Saturn is kind of like there's a disruption. There's a disruption to the traditional ways of doing things. We could also say during a Uranus conjunct Saturn, we could see, new announcements in the technology space, which could bring about some new direction. So Uranus conjunct Saturn is a negative, but can bring about some positive, unexpected changes. But I would definitely see a lot of caution around Uranus conjunct Saturn. So now, looking at the slide, I want you just to kind of take note of these very negative transits, Saturn conjunct Sun and Jupiter opposite Pluto, as well as the Uranus conjunct Saturn. We see them happening at 3 times separately from one another. What becomes interesting is if we look at this chart. Now, this chart in this what's known as P2, planet 2, these are the planets for the actual birth chart of the NASDAQ index. And on the left, these are the transiting, the moving planets. And here we have Saturn on the Sun. So the one that I'm just talking about in March is over here. But what happens is that Saturn moves forward and then moves backwards and forwards again. And we see that there's a period really where from September through to early December, Saturn is in effect on the NASDAQ Sun. The Jupiter opposite Pluto, which we spoke about a little bit earlier, is in effect in early May, which I showed in the trading view chart, the correlation there. But we see that here now in October through until December, that Jupiter comes in opposition to Pluto. And in addition, as I said, right now we're in this period of Uranus conjunct Saturn running through until June. This Uranus-Saturn conjunction, it's the second hit, which means it's the retrograde hit. In other words, Uranus appears to be moving backwards in the sky. When planets are retrograde, they tend to be more kind of difficult to deal with. There's greater sort of negative energy to that planetary transit. What we have here is really astrologically a perfect storm. One hit to a chart, you can't really make a direct prediction. You can sometimes, and we will see correlations as I showed you in these March and May hits. But here we have in November 3 hits to the NASDAQ chart, all in the same month, overlapping one another. 3 hits, any astrologer is going to look at this and say, there is something extremely negative and challenging to this chart coming. And being the NASDAQ composite index, I am really seeing October, November to be a major, major downturn in the NASDAQ index. So that is something that we need to really look into. Well, what we're seeing later on in the, we're seeing some hits from Jupiter. So Jupiter is definitely bringing some kind of expansion into the market. And they're kind of positive hits from Jupiter really between the period of May and August, September. So it does look to be, and we'll get into the Bitcoin hits, that we could be having a bit of a let's say, a market recovery that's going to run up until October, November. Looking at the NASDAQ chart. Then a really interesting correlation in the quantum questioning astrology. So I had a client who on the 12th of May asked the question, does she leave her money in the stock market or does she move her money into cash or crypto? Because she's also very aware and worried about a coming recession, a coming crash in the stock market. All of her money currently resides in the stock market. Now, the way questioning astrology works is completely different to what most people who may understand a bit of astrology in terms of transits, the motion of the current planets. This works on a completely different system. This is the chart from the time the question is asked of the astrologer. And there's some really fascinating timings which kind of correlate, interestingly enough, with that NASDAQ timings. So Mercury is the planet which shows her money and her investments, and it is also the planet of stocks and trading, currently in the sign of Gemini when the question was asked. So essentially very strong, but Mercury had just turned retrograde 2 days before she asked this question. So indicating there was a negative motion coming into play. So in other words, the value of her money was moving negative in terms of being in the stock market. So Mercury retrogrades out of the sign of Gemini into Taurus. And in this kind of astrology, we can work out a timing to see as things happen. The Mercury is the planet that represents her money, her investments. And the timing from this chart shows that 4.5 months after she asked the question, which is from mid-May, takes us to the end of September, beginning of October. So it's saying that she needs to take her money out of the stock market, end of September, beginning of October, and it's moving into Taurus. Taurus is what's known as a fixed earth sign. As a zodiac, fixed means it's more stable, things that are more stable, things that don't change so easily in value, like Gemini. Gemini is a changing, moving zodiac sign. So it could well indicate that she needs to move her money into cash or commodities. Then we see that this Mercury journey continues, because Mercury not only just enters backwards into Taurus, but will then move for another, and the timing works out, for another 4 months. That takes us to February 2023. It then stops and turns and now moves forwards again, and will re-enter Gemini, where Mercury finds great strength in May of 2023. So, are we in for a 8-9 month serious bear market starting in October, November? This correlation between these two charts is very fascinating. And whenever I see two totally different methodologies correlate, then I really sit up and say, okay, we've got something here that we need to take note of. So that is something, just as an aside, I wanted to bring it in to show a fascinating correlation, again highlighting that period of September, October, November as being critical. The key Bitcoin events, this is in British summertime, and as of today, Mars has moved into Aries. And as I said earlier, when Mars is in Aries, he's in the sign that he rules. Mars is what's known as a malefic planet in astrology. He is a planet that tends to do things negatively. So Mars is the energy of cutting things down, and in Aries, he very much is this warrior energy. So there's some concern with Mars being in Aries. And when Mars is in the early degrees of Aries, he makes some negative aspects with the Bitcoin chart. what is interesting is that Mars will join Jupiter in the sky on the 29th of May, which is an interesting event because Jupiter brings expansion. Mars, as I say, he's the warrior. In Aries, he's very much the warrior. So again, you know, as a global event, when planets come together in the sky, then they tend to operate on a more global thing. And we can see, like, you know, is there joining together in the sky something that can relate to the personal chart, to the chart of the event or the chart of the person. So Mars conjunct Jupiter is worrying from a, you know, is this an increase in the war situation in Ukraine? Is there some kind of knock-on effect? Is this something, it's very much like it's a signature of the increase of war that is concerning and worrying. When it comes to Bitcoin, we are seeing that Jupiter, I mean, I'm very bullish about the end of this month for Bitcoin, because Jupiter will come onto the Bitcoin moon, which is on the 30th. So we have pretty much, you know, Mars together with Jupiter as a very strong energy, Jupiter's expansion coming together on the Bitcoin moon. So the 30th of May through to the 6th of June is a very bullish time. However, the very next day on the 31st of May, Mars squares the Bitcoin Mars, which is a negative event. Then, you know, from the 6th of June, we see that Jupiter squares that Mars, again, a negative event. So we kind of like got a bit of an up and down. And then Mars squares the Bitcoin sun from the 10th of June to the 12th of June. So we're seeing a lot of action from Mars and Jupiter. So both very energetic planets. Jupiter, it just conflagrates and expands things, and Mars just sort of moves forward and, you know, with a lot of energy. So there's a lot of energy coming to the Bitcoin chart in June, end of June, beginning of June. Visually, if we want to have a look here, some other dates that are like important. So here we have, and look, this is now looking on kind of a more of a longer term view of things. So Jupiter comes onto the Bitcoin moon here in June. He then is going to turn retrograde, and we're going to have a retrograde hit in September. And as I said, you know, retrograde is often an indication of things moving backwards, even though Jupiter by nature expands things. When he's moving retrograde, his expansion energy is kind of like contained because he's moving backwards, you know. And then simultaneously, just after and just before, we have Jupiter squaring Mars as a negative energy. The Uranus sextile Uranus, which is happening, comes into effect from middle of July right through to kind of beginning of October. Doesn't go exact, but it does. It is a harmonious and positive sign, showing that, you know, are we in this period? You know, Uranus, as I said earlier, is a signature of technology. And, you know, cryptocurrency is kind of like the new technology kid on the block. So Uranus making an aspect to the Uranus of the Bitcoin chart is an indication of some positive energy coming through for the Bitcoin chart. But, you know, it's not that simple, because right there in end of July, beginning of August, we see Saturn come onto Neptune. And the Saturn onto Neptune is, we've had one hit already, has been quite negative. And then again, we see that negative hit in December. So, those are considerations, and obviously as the months go down in the Patreon group, we'll dive deeper into what's happening in each of these months. But just to kind of like look forward, this for me, is probably the biggest worry is the Jupiter square Pluto, which kicks in for Bitcoin in the middle of October. So, is this the correlation with that negative hits for October, November for the NASDAQ chart? Are we seeing, a negative hit to the Bitcoin chart correlating? But again, the confusing part is that we have a Jupiter sextile Jupiter. Jupiter sextile Jupiter is positive, but not as positive in a counterweight to the negative of a Jupiter square Pluto. So we have a period here on October, November, December of sort of positivity for the Bitcoin chart. But, then in November, we have Neptune coming on to Saturn. Doesn't come fully on, but it's enough to say that there's an influence of, Neptune brings a disillusion energy. So, are we in a period from November where everyone is in a sense of disillusion? The most important event of 2023 for the Bitcoin chart, and I've spoken about this in my previous monthly webinars, is Pluto will come on to Jupiter really from end of January, making an exact hit on the 3rd of March, 2023, and stays in effect, making another hit on the 3rd of July. So it's pretty much most of 2023, we have this incredibly slow and powerful hit of Pluto on Jupiter. Pluto on Jupiter, what's Pluto on Jupiter? Well, you'll actually discover, if you look at the birth charts of many of the billionaires, Elon Musk has it, Michael, what's his name? Suddenly I've gone blank. Our Bitcoin guy has invested lots of his money into Bitcoin, the CEO of MicroStrategy. He's got a Pluto Jupiter signature in his chart. Bill Gates has a Pluto Jupiter signature. So it's very much what I call a billionaire signature. So my prediction is that in 2023, we're going to see something very dramatic happen with Bitcoin. Is this a correlation of a deep market recession? Is this going to be the decoupling of Bitcoin from the NASDAQ, from technology stocks? Are we going to see people really turn to Bitcoin as a store of value, as a safe haven, as we're seeing a great decline in the stock market? I went to a talk today on kind of long-term sort of financial viewpoints, and the viewpoint is that 2023 is going to be a pretty negative time in all financial areas. But I think that whenever Pluto comes, Pluto brings complete transformation and rebirth, and so yes, Michael Saylor. So Bitcoin, Pluto brings complete transformation, whatever he touches. So my prediction, and remains to be seen, is that 2023 is going to be a dramatic year financially. And we're going to see something really dramatic happen with Bitcoin. I knew back, that 2020 was going to be a significant time. In particularly, we had the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, and pretty much took place on the Bitcoin Jupiter. So we knew way back that in there will be a significant jump in the Bitcoin price. And similarly now, we're having a Pluto onto Jupiter in 2023, and there'll be a third hit in 2024. It's a very, very significant, very transformative. And I personally believe that this is going to be, what's going to take Bitcoin to a whole new level. And I think there could well be a decoupling from tracking the technology stocks. So just to the longer term, dates, the Neptune opposite Bitcoin Saturn was negative in January through to February, and now again November, which correlates with that bad negative date we saw on the NASDAQ chart. November through to December, we have a negative. We have the Jupiter square Pluto, that's happening in October and again in December, so we have another negative there. We've got the Saturn conjunct Bitcoin Neptune, also strongly negative. That's happening in July through to August, and again December through to January. So it's not, the rest of this year is very tricky. I think we're going to see a short-term recovery period. Probably going to see a recovery now at the end of May. And then we're going to see some recovery through this year, rising up until about September, October. So I'd take my money into cash around September, October. And it's pretty much in correlation with what my client, the answer to her particular question. All of this, we spoke about the Pluto conjunct Jupiter. All of this is happening in a year when the United States is having their Pluto return. So the Pluto return takes place every 246 years, 248 years. And this is really 248 years after 1776, the independence of the United States. We are having a Pluto return. Now, whenever a planet returns to the same place in the chart, there is a major shift in consciousness. If it's your own personal chart, one of the first returns that most people are familiar with is known as the Saturn return. The Saturn return happens when you're 28, 29 years old, because that's the cycle of Saturn. And for most people, that they'll remember and look at their lives and see that this was a major time in their life. They either got married, they got divorced, they really made some major change in their career. There was something really challenging around 28, 29 years old. Human beings don't have Pluto returns, but countries do. And countries that have been in existence for longer than the United States, they've had their returns and there's been dramatic changes. So we're seeing that and knowing that, there's a dramatic change coming financially to the United States. And, the impact of the Pluto return, not only is it a Pluto return, it's also a return in the second house. So there's an astrology chart is divided into houses, which are areas of life. And the second house is the house of wealth and finance and value. So it's indicating that there is a transformation coming to the whole financial system upon which the United States is based. Pretty much, the seeds of that transformation will happen in this year. But we often see that the integration of a Pluto experience can take a couple of years to unfold, but the dramatic events. So, this is a year of dramatic financial events. This isn't, 2020 when things just skyrocketed. A lot to do with the printing of US dollars. That's not going to happen this year. We know that interest rates are going to be rising this year. cutting back on the printing of money. So it's a very challenging time that we're in, but my prediction is that, you know, end of this month, we're going to see a bit of a recovery in the Bitcoin chart. But long term, I am very wary of what's going to happen in September, October. I think the NASDAQ chart and my client's personal chart question are very, very interesting. So yes, that's one last piece that I wanted to just bring was when Pluto comes onto the Bitcoin Jupiter, I wanted to see what happens to the NASDAQ chart. So I've got 3 charts running. I've got 3 events here. So basically the first chart over here is the March of 2023. We have the first Pluto coming onto the Bitcoin Jupiter. Inside you have the NASDAQ chart. So we see that when Pluto is on the Bitcoin Jupiter, he is basically very close to being on the Mercury of NASDAQ. Now, Mercury is the planet of trade and communication. So in some ways, and Mercury is also in the NASDAQ chart, what's known as the most elevated chart. He sits here in the 10th house. And he's very strong. So we're seeing that a transformation is coming to the NASDAQ. And it gets particularly interesting, the second hit. And generally the second hits is when the planet is retrograde. So here's Pluto retrograde, hence it's shown in red writing here. The degrees and minutes are shown as this is a retrograde planet. The retrograde hit is happening. And at that same time, we have what's called the nodal axis exactly on the ascendant descendant point of the NASDAQ chart. This is very interesting for an astrologer because we're seeing a planet of transformation coming onto one of the most important planets in the chart. And we're seeing the nodal axis is called the sort of point of karma and destiny. We know that when the nodes move across what's known as the crosser matter, there's a fundamental shift in the whole nature of the person or the entity being affected by these the nodal points. So this particular July 2023 says there's a fundamental event and shift which has impact upon NASDAQ and has impact upon the Bitcoin chart. So my prediction really is, you know, that there's going to be some major decoupling of the two. And I do think, you know, this is like the new revolution, the new internet, Web3 that everyone's working towards, the metaverse. You know, right now we're in a bit of a kind of negative state. Everyone's in a state of depression and people are thinking, oh, you know, this is the end of crypto. But this is just the beginning. We know this is just the beginning of crypto. And, you know, I'm excited. I know that, you know, we're in for a very difficult financial period. Probably from what I see from that client's chart of mine, I would predict at least an 8-month bear market starting in September, October, November of this year. But in 2023, we do see some event correlating with NASDAQ and with the Bitcoin chart. So that for me is super fascinating and super interesting. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'm welcome to take questions to ask a question, just I can unmute you if you want to ask a specific question, or you can just pop the question into the chat. If not, I will leave it there, and thank you for everybody for attending. We are certainly in for some interesting times. This webinar will be available in my Patreon group as a recording. So if anyone wants to watch it again, you can join the Patreon group. It's $20 a month, and this recording will be available. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and good luck with your trades.